Welcome back, everyone. So for our next session, we've got a panel talking about scaling fintechs to international markets. This session will focus on how to successfully scale a fintech into global markets, showcasing successful Australian exporters, learning from their varied modes of market entry, issues faced and lessons learned, as well as the investor view, why they originally chose Australia, how they entered the market, what they considered, and what their growth plans are for the next few years. On the panel today, we have Lachlan Heussler from Indebted, Megan Haas from Handdii, Tristan Dakin from Wise, and moderating we have Sally-Ann Watts from Austrade. Welcome, guys.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. I'm very pleased to be representing the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. You may not be aware, but in the budget last year, there was a considerable amount of money, $9.6 million, given to the Australian Trade Commission and to Treasury to support the fintech industry to scale up internationally. That program has two elements. One is helping companies through a range of different services to go international, particularly to the UK, Singapore and the US. And it also has a focus on trying to attract more fintech businesses into Australia. So if any of you have got an interest in either understanding more about what we do for investors or actually what we could do for your business, Austrade is running office hours, so in the room next door, you can book an appointment with an Austrade person to talk about what we can do to help your business go international. But today, our panel is called Scaling Fintech to International Markets. And on your app for Intersect, you'll see the background of our three panellists today who are all leading either exporters or investors in Australia. We have Lachlan Heussler from Indebted, Megan Haas, who's representing Handdii here today from Scale Investors, and Tristan Dakin from Wise. So some of you have been overseas will know Wise. They're an investor in Australia. So without further ado, I'd like to start with a question to all of our panellists. And I'd like them to talk to us a little bit about how they decided on their first international market. When there's so many to choose from, how did they work out which one to go into first? And so I'd like to start with Megan.
Thanks very much, Sally-Ann, and good morning all. From Handdii's perspective, it was down to the size of the opportunity. So Handdii targets small claims and property from an insurance perspective. In Australia, the total claims market 500,000. America was 11 million. So, it was an obvious focus area. The conversation we had at the time was around timing. When was the right time? But in terms of where to first, that was clear.
So big market rather than small market and test.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Lachlan. No, which one's Lachlan?
Lachlan, that's me. Hi, I'm Lachlan. I'm from Indebted. Indebted operates in what is without a doubt the sexiest part of fintech, and that's debt collection. In answer to your question, the reason, technically the first market that we went into was New Zealand, but I'll assume that they're just our Antipodean cousins, and so we'll leave that to the side. But our next market was Canada. And the reason that we chose that market was because one of our existing clients came to us and said, can you come and help us in this market? So that's obviously a nice way for us to enter a new market. So we went through a process, and from go to whoa in about 7 weeks, we stood up a proposition for them and went live in December last year.
Wow, that's amazing. That's during COVID times. I'll come back to what you did differently during COVID. But Tristan, Australia wasn't your first market.
No.
How did you choose?
Yeah, it wasn't. Our first market was the UK and Europe, really. It's a pretty obvious answer. So our founders, Tristan and Tarvet, they're Estonia. One was in the UK, one was in Estonia, trying to figure out how to pay mortgages in each opposing country. And so really the idea of TransferWise at the time, Wise now, it was born from that concept. And then, very organically from there, realise that these problems exist everywhere else in the world, so that kind of drives the international expansion.
And how did you land on Australia?
From an expansion perspective, our market choices are really driven by our customers, and so it's this primary feedback loop from our existing customer base on where they need to send money and you know, those remittance corridors that are important to them, and all our expansion decisions really stem from that. So it's always driven by the customers.
So how many markets are you in now?
Great question. I should know.
She's put you on the spot there.
We can send money to 80 countries globally, and we can send money out of about 43 countries globally. So we're pretty wide.
Right, okay, I won't push you on that one. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about channels to market, and we'll go back to Tristan. Channels to market, which channels do you use to go to market, and have you discarded any because they didn't work?
Yeah, so not really. I guess leaning back on my previous point, our sort of go-to-market strategy and channels to market has always been the same from day one. And again, it's just driven by our customer feedback and our sort of the wishes of the customer. And all product decisions at Wise are really based on what they need from a remittance perspective. And then when we sort of enter into those markets, it's for us, you know, we talk about disruption and sort of shaking up the banking industry. It's really then an education piece, really, and educating that market on the fees that they're being charged, and sort of trying to drive transparency through the remittance industry in those specific countries.
So it's a direct to consumer? That's your strategy, channel strategy?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Yep, okay. Lachlan, what's your channel to market?
I mean, most of our stuff is with existing clients. So we work very heavily with the FinTech and the buy now, pay later industry. And as you would well know, that those particular clients are growing dramatically around the world. So we have conversations with them, and it's, you know, we are in this market, can you come and help us, or what markets are you going to enter? But I think, like, from our perspective, the more specific answer to that question is, how do we actually do it? Do we go organically into those markets, or do we have to go and buy a business to enter those markets? Now, we've done both. So we went organically into New Zealand, into Canada. We've been trying to go organically for about 10 months into the UK, and that's another story. But we bought a business in the US on the 1st of January this year in order to enter that market. And the strategy behind that was we needed to obtain about 60 different licenses to operate the services that we do throughout the US. And for us to do that organically would have taken at least 24 months. We bought a business on the 1st of January, and we've rebranded it and relaunched it under our brand as of the 1st of May. So it's only taken us about, and we had the benefit of having all of the revenue and all of the clients, and we'll run a second stage process of then transferring that existing business into our operating platform over the rest of this calendar year. So for our perspective, the question is, you know, is it organic or inorganic? I've just organically set up operations in Singapore and Malaysia. There's way less regulation up there, so we can just essentially deploy our platform, and we don't have to have anyone on the ground in order to operate the services that we do. So it really depends on the regulatory structure and framework of the country that you want to enter into, and that sort of dictates how you enter that market.
Right, so the US is the odd one out. You're mostly going to Commonwealth countries.
Correct. I mean, and it's not, it's sort of, I guess it's a bit by chance. They're all English speaking. They have a relatively stable legal framework. The regulatory framework's easy to understand. The US was a different market entirely, and we, you know, had a look at going organically and spoke to a few people over there, and every single one of them said, buy a business that's already licensed. And so that's what we did. So we identified an acquisition target, we did DD, we raised some money to purchase that business, successfully purchased it, and we did it all without meeting anyone in person. So it was all done over Zoom. Wow,
that's impressive. Megan, your Handdii is in the US. How did you go to market?
Not like that. No, so we were very fortunate to the extent that the founders were invited to participate in an InsurTech incubator, through which they made a number of connections and started a network. Had a number of conversations with others in the industry, and that then led to opportunities. The anchor client in the US is an insurtech as well called Hippo. They then formed a relationship with Hippo, and that was the first customer to go, or client to go live in the US. So that's how that was done, but still very much an Australian business.
Right, okay. So quite different. So I'll just stay with you, Megan. The last 12 months, you're talking about everything that you've done, but we haven't been able to travel, and COVID obviously has been a huge issue. How has that changed the way you've operated and done your growth in the US?
So hindsight's a wonderful thing. So at the time when COVID hit, our CEO was actually in the US participating with an Austrade launching pad incubator event. So she was there, and we had a founder here in Australia. So we were servicing both markets. As the pandemic evolved, some decisions needed to be made, and they were made based on what was currently happening in the market, what the opportunities were for Handdii at the time. So both founders elected to be in the US, which is where they still are today. So in terms of how we then operated, well, much the same as everybody else. It became an online opportunity. The ability to engage with the insurance companies, but equally build up the contractor network. So Handdii operates with a contractor network for the services in residential properties, etc. Was able to be built up through the contacts that were then made in the US online and very successfully, to the extent that some of the Australian insurers, which had been a bit slower to adopt Handdii, are now actively engaged.
Right, that's amazing. So, Lachlan, you were also talking about what you did in the US in particular through COVID. Can you talk about whether did it slow you down, do you think, in the end?
I don't think so. I actually think it sped it up, to be honest, because we could get instant access to people in the US and didn't have to travel and wait and book meeting times and all that sort of stuff. So that was, I think, a plus, and I don't think it's ever going back, by the way. So I think that online meetings and will continue like forever. It's just so much easier for us to jump on a Zoom call with an advisor or a lawyer or someone that we're doing due diligence on in another jurisdiction. So that won't change. But what's been more interesting is we've hired 2 of our C-suite without ever meeting them in person in the last 3 months. And then when we bought this asset in the US, we acquired 60 people that we haven't ever met before. And what's been super interesting is trying to integrate the 2 cultures together remotely. We were very lucky in the sense that we found some amazing people to work on our behalf in the US in order to undertake that process. But that's been a learning exercise for everybody involved, for sure.
But inspiring, I think. Tristan, COVID, what's it meant for you guys?
I think initially there was this period of observation, I guess, and seeing what effect it was going to have on sort of volumes and remittance flows. To be honest, it was kind of business as usual in the end for us. Obviously, there was these shifts away from the obvious industries like physical retail and travel and things like that. But then we also saw this proliferation of online business and e-commerce, and a big shift towards business transactions and business remittance and online spend using cards and things like that. And exactly what Lachlan says from a business perspective, I don't think it's going back, and we've done a lot of remote hiring, and we added 2 new board members to the group over Zoom meetings and never meeting them in person. And it's also opened up really interesting conversations with the regulators, specifically here in Australia, where we maybe are a few steps behind in terms of their expectation of having physical headcount in certain locations to fulfill certain requirements and things like that, which was always tricky conversations to have to explain that, no, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But I think that's aided those conversations in a real way, in a positive way. So,
do you think they're listening?
Yeah, that's another question, I think.
Take that one offline.
Hopefully.
Actually, I do want to go to the regulation point, not specifically about Australia, but we hear that one of the biggest hurdles to be overcome for people going overseas is understanding the regulatory environment in the target market, and you've all referred to it. But how did you go about trying to understand the complexity and making sure that you're compliant? So I'll start with you, Lachlan.
Carefully. It's definitely a key part of exporting any sort of financial service around the world is to understand what the regulatory frameworks are like in the market that you're going into. And it's actually the way we think about it, it's part of the competitive moat that we're building around our business, because the clients that we work with, they trust us to understand the specific requirements in the markets that we're operating in. You know, to give you an example, in Canada, you know, one of our clients sent us a bunch of files and a week later we hadn't collected anything, and they rang us up and they said, you know, what the hell's going on? And we said, well, we're still in the notice of assignment period where we can't contact the customer after the initial outreach. And they're like, we didn't even know about that. And it's like, well, that's why you're working with us, is because we need to take away that complexity and make a simple API for them to connect to, and we take care of everything else. So, but it's difficult. I mean, it involves like heaps of desktop research, and then reaching out to potentially, you know, some sort of advisor or law firm in the jurisdiction that you're operating in, paying a few $1,000s to get a piece of advice, and then taking that advice and implementing it into the business operations. From our perspective, we write it into the code of the platform so that the platform enforces the regulatory requirements of that jurisdiction, and we're not relying on a process operation which is prone to error. And so that's an advantage that we have as a business. But I would say that it's not easy to understand the regulatory frameworks overseas, and as much as the regulator's telling you that they try and make it easy, it's still not easy to do.
Did you use advisors?
I mean, we have in some certain circumstances paid some lawyers to do that. Like definitely in the UK, we spent a bit of money to navigate the FCA process, which isn't complete yet and still ongoing. But we have worked with certain law firms in certain jurisdictions in order to receive advice, because that gives us some level of certainty that we're operating within the rules for that particular market, especially if we're deploying capital to acquire an asset in that particular region to get operational.
Tristan, for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, so we, as you've pointed out, we operate in a few sort of markets globally. I think we benefit from the fact that we've rolled out in a lot of different markets. We sort of have this process in place, and it starts with getting someone on the ground there to really understand the local regulation and licensing requirements, and conversations with banks and lawyers and advisors and those sorts of things. And sort of, I guess, leading on from what Lockie was saying, I cannot overstate the importance of having an expert on the ground in that local jurisdiction that understands specifically that regulation and those licensing requirements, because every market is slightly different, has little different nuances. And whether that's employing someone internally and having them there, or it's consulting, taking external counsel, and speaking to experts, it's absolutely, it's probably the boring, obvious answer to that, but it's really crucial. So we sort of engage all those different aspects.
And Megan.
Yes, and following on, I think from Tristan, from a Handdii perspective, we found Austrade and the landing pad in San Francisco particularly helpful there, because through that facility, we were able to have introductions to the legal folks, to some accountants, to different sets of advisors that understood and had been sort of briefed on the situation that an incoming entity from Australia, finds itself in. So I think Handdii found that very, very helpful. Equally, we engage in a partnership of sorts, with the insurance companies with whom we work. So we're able to also engage with them and understand and leverage off their understanding of, what needs to happen. And I think that helps, because we're not starting from scratch each time, albeit in the US, there are different requirements across the different states, particularly from a privacy impact or privacy assessment, and we're talking about, residential property claims, et cetera, et cetera. So,
The US is like 50 countries.
Exactly.
Yeah, complex. Okay. Another issue if for businesses wanting to scale quickly is access to finance, right? And so Megan's with Scale Investors. Megan, can you just talk a little bit about your experience with Handdii, how you got involved, what was the process, etc. And then I might ask Tristan and Lachlan to talk a little bit about their approach to finance as well. Yeah.
Okay, so this predates me and my relationship with both Handdii and Scale. I came to the party a little later, but it started back in early 2019. That initial introduction and the relationship, I suppose, went, and the due diligence relationship went across the next 6 to 9 months. This was pre-product, but there was an initial anchor client through Allianz in Australia. The founders obviously had deep technical expertise and solid backgrounds. And Scale Investors is an angel group built up with female professionals across all sorts of different domains. So actuaries, lawyers, accountants, consultants, all sorts of different interested parties there who were able to understand the challenge and the value prop that the Handdii solution offered. So over a period of 6 to 9 months, there were a number of engagements and discussions. And equally, there was an original seed investor as well that was on board. And, really it was then the courting process across that almost a year before the initial seed round.
Okay, thank you. Lachlan, how did you guys go about early finance and funding rounds?
That's a good question. I mean, my introduction to Indebted, I was an angel investor into the company. So I was an investor in the company, and then I subsequently joined the company 2 years later to help them execute the stuff. But we took some seed money from some high net worths that we knew around the market, and then rolled into a early round from Reinventure. I introduced Josh to Danny and Simon, and we got that deal done. And we've sort of stepped up, and we've been very lucky in the sense that we've had partnerships from Aussie VCs like Reinventure, Carthona, and then recently Mass Mutual out of Singapore. There are different types of finance available out there, and we've gone through that journey in the last 6 months. When we acquired this asset in the US, we raised venture debt from the Australian market to acquire that business, which was new for us. And we're having conversations more recently with sort of more equity investors rather than the VC stuff. So what you're finding is a lot of the public market guys are coming further down into the private ecosystem and are providing capital, and it's oftentimes on better terms, if that makes sense. So they don't want a board seat. We're not dealing with tons of tricky liquidation preferences and ratchets and things like that. It's more vanilla, ordinary priced equity. And so that market, which I think has been a little bit underdeveloped in Australia for the last few years, over the last 18 months has really stepped up. And, the other thing that's interesting about Australia is that the listed market is a genuine option for early stage companies. Whereas in the US, if you were to try and list on NASDAQ, if you had a market cap less than $1 billion, they don't really want to know you. So, and you've seen many people in Australia in the FinTech ecosystem list early on the exchange and do particularly well. I mean, Afterpay and Zip and these guys are classic examples. But more recently, you've seen from those particular companies saying that we probably went too early to the public market. So again, there's a bit of a balance. But the capital markets in Australia, both private and public market investors, are very deep and getting deeper. And if you have a great company that's growing quickly and a solid team behind you, financing in Australia is definitely available. That said, you do have these big funds that are coming into Australia at the moment. I mean, you just have to see the rounds that Octopus Deploy have done And I think Tiger Global knows who everybody is in the market down here. So there's lots of money from offshore, looking to find a home in Australia and New Zealand.
Good time to be a fintech, growing. And how about for Wise, Tristan? What was the finance story for them?
To be honest, I'm definitely not the most qualified person to answer this from a Wise perspective. We were founded in 2011, which is a bit before my time. I can speak, I guess, a little bit more specifically to the Australian operations, and we've recently got our licensing at the end of last year from sort of a limited ADI perspective, which means we're prudentially regulated now. So from a finance perspective, that comes with very strict capital and liquidity requirements that we have to adhere to here, which we don't have to anywhere else in the world. So I think from that perspective, it's a really interesting process of having that operational oversight to make sure you meet those sort of that's the big financial burden and obligation on us in Australia from a group perspective. So we have to have obviously good coordination with our broader global finance teams to make sure we meet those requirements.
Okay, can I just turn to another issue that sometimes is a challenge when you're trying to grow quickly overseas and in Australia, and that's access to talented staff. And so I just wonder how you've, Lachlan, we'll start with you. How have you managed that in the markets that you've gone into, accessing good people? How have you done that?
It's without a doubt the hardest part to growing a business. Like, there's no question. There's nothing that comes in second to finding great talent. And I think COVID's actually made it more difficult because of the fact that everyone now has the opportunity to work wherever they want around the world. So, the notion of selling Sydney or Melbourne and Australia and the beautiful lifestyle we have here is great. But if they don't want to come here, like there's lots of other options around the world. But so it's offering, it's having a good culture, offering, competitive comp and equity in the business and things like that. But the other option is you can acqui-hire. And so when we acquired this business in the US, we not only bought it mainly for the licenses, but we inherited 60 people as part of that transaction. And so, we filled a massive gap in terms of scale in one fell swoop. And that's definitely an option that's a little bit left field, but I don't think anyone's perfectly solved how to hire great people because it's still a challenge.
Yeah. Megan, you're also in the US. How are you going about finding people?
Leveraging the networks. It's all about leveraging the networks for us, and I think that word of mouth as well. So the cultural element, absolutely really important. People wanting to engage. The teams, we have resources in Australia, resources in the US. We have our product lead now in KL. One of the things that we've found is the geography that used to be so important is less so for us now, and we're building a virtual team that can leverage off each other and quasi follow the sun, which provides different opportunities in terms of service levels. So,
yeah. Tristan, how are you finding it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, right? I think it's come up a few times over the last couple of days, and agree with Lachlan. Particularly, it's a very, very hard time to hire at the moment. Whether it be because borders are closed and people can't move internationally, it definitely shrinks the talent pool. And with COVID, people are being able to work wherever they want, basically. We've always really tried to leverage the cultural aspect and create a working environment that people enjoy and they want to come to. So really, it's two-pronged for us. It's cultural and it's also product. Obviously, helps to have people believe in what they're building and the end goal. So that really does come into play when we're looking to.
I actually think that's a good point. It's like having a mission that the employees want to strive towards, and for us, it's we're dealing with consumers that are often in a difficult circumstance. So if we can have some little impact in terms of making their day better, that's kind of what we want to do. And to Tristan's point, it's like having that mission in what you're doing, and it might be a product. You might work with amazing engineers that are building an awesome product, and people want to come and work with other amazing people that are doing that. So there's lots of different factors, but it definitely plays a point.
I'd also add to that, we've been very fortunate and acquired some talent that ordinarily we may not have had access to without COVID. So early on, you know, there were organisations that were confronted with some challenging times in terms of their workforce, and so that resulted in some changed circumstances for some individuals, and we very opportunistically were able to really leverage that and you know, engage some people that ordinarily perhaps we might not have had access to.
So I'm getting the wind up now. I think we could go on for another half hour easily. There is a session on Greater China this afternoon if any of you are interested. But I think we've been really fortunate today to have Lachlan, Tristan and Megan here to share some of their stories with you. I hope it's inspired you, and thank you very much everyone, and can you please join me in thanking our panellists.
Thank you very much to our panellists.